Hello and welcome to another episode of JP Comtech's Tech Talks. Today we're going to be talking about HDR photography and a little bit what that means, but more importantly, how to process those HDR images into Photoshop. So before we get going, I'm just going to show you a little bit of stuff in Adobe Bridge. Here we are in Adobe Bridge. As you can see, I've already gotten my images taken. So I went in few different opportunities here. I got a chance to take the camera out with the JP Rowing Club, as well as some family trips that I've been on a couple summers ago. So here's a couple different examples that you can see. We'll do both of them, and I'll show you the differences when processing those into HDR. The first example here, just so you can see what an HDR photography, or what an HDR photo I should say, is basically a composition of three images put together. So you have, when you go out with your camera, you're going to make sure that your ISO is set to be a consistent ISO. It can't be an automatic ISO, or it will change the exposure on each photo and thus not allowing for the proper HDR. If you don't know what HDR stands for, it stands for high dynamic range. So these images are what would normally not be able to be captured with a single image in a photo. A lot of you guys' smartphones these days create HDR images in one step, but they're actually taking multiple pictures in the background or using some form of dual pixel technology to do that. And that allows them to take those multiple images, process them together, and create a single HDR image for you all in one step. What we're going to do is break that down a little bit so that we need to take the images and then from there be able to process those images out. Now this was a bit of a dim day that we were out on the water, a little bit cloudy. So I knew it would be kind of a fun representation of HDR photography. So essentially what HDR photography is that we're taking three different photos. So we're taking one photo that would be considered to be somewhat properly exposed or exposed for the proper lighting and stuff. You wouldn't want to have it be too bright or too dark. And then we're going to take a second image that's a little bit darker or underexposed, allowing for more depth in the clouds or in the lighter areas of your photo. And then a third image that's what some would consider overexposed. In this case, probably the proper exposure for the scene, but we lose our sky. If you notice, there's no real detail in our sky in this image. So we want to take these three images, put them together, and create one seamless photo out of the deal. Now, in Adobe Bridge, there's a few tools that we can use to help us. So if I select all of these photos, so I'm going to select all three of them, so you can do a control and then click the three individual photos you might need, or you can simply click the first image and hold shift and select all three of them. Okay, you're going to go up to tools at the top here, down to Photoshop, and then we're going to merge to HDR Pro. And what this merge to HDR Pro does is it automatically opens up Photoshop for us. It will bring in the individual layers, it'll bring in those individual images as individual layers in our document, and then it's going to open up a processor called HDR Pro. Now it opened on my other screen here. I'm going to put it in here so that we can see it and get it to fit. There we go. So this merge to HDR Pro brings it up and it shows us a few different things. It shows us the overall size. So in this case, we're going to go, this is 100%. We're going to go so we can sort of see the whole picture. Just fit it to the screen here. It also shows us the three different images that we are trying to combine here. So these three images, if I select each one of them, nothing happens. But if I say remove ghosts, which is often a process that we need to do because of the fact that sometimes maybe the camera moved, or there might be an issue, or whatever it might be, especially if you're taking an HDR where there happens to be people walking, there might be a stray person in your photo in one of the images. By removing the ghosts, that means that that image, it'll take one of the images and use that as the template for which people or which object should stay in the photo, And if that object looks a little funny or looks like a duplicate in the other images, it will automatically take that out. You can select different, the 3 different photos, you can select each one of them to tell it which one you want to take out. I usually pick the one in the middle. It tends to be the one that the camera interprets the images the best, but also that those objects are usually the ones you want to keep, and the other 2 will leave and let the camera get rid of those. Okay? There's a ton of presets at the top here. There's a few that I've created, some other really cool ones. They will do very different things to your image. This one's more of a flatter look. You can do a photorealistic, high contrast. Again, it's going to do different things when we select remove ghosts. You notice it's very, very high contrast. You see you have a super dark middle section here and a really light sky. You can go into, I like this Scott 5 one. It gives you that classic kind of oversaturated, over-sharpened photo that you often see when it comes to HDR photography. I usually tend to dim it down a little bit, so I use my own preset, which I saved, but it tends to give a fairly good result. Now, are these photos always crystal clear, perfect? It depends. It depends on if you use a tripod. It depends on how much the clouds moved. It depends on, in this case, did the water move at all? Was it a windy day? There's so many different variations as to how true and how crisp your HDR photos will come out once you're taking them. I often will handhold my HDR photos. That's maybe not the best practice, but oftentimes when I'm out and about and I see an image that I think might look really cool, I will just make sure that my lowest exposure value is not too slow that I can't handhold it. So in this case, the darker image, when we were still outside, even though it was darker, or excuse me, the lighter image, I should say, the darker image is using a faster shutter speed, so it wouldn't matter about hand holding, but oftentimes the brighter image requires a slower shutter speed, and therefore sometimes it goes below that 1/60th of a second threshold that we're not able to hand hold it anymore. So be careful of that, because you don't want to have a really blurry third photo, or this isn't going to work very well. So we'll just go through the settings a little bit here that I've chosen. The radius, I've set it to 100 and somewhere in the 130 pixel range. If I crank it all the way up, you can kind of see it tends to like soften things quite a bit, whereas if I go down to nothing, you get a very flat, kind of mushy view. So in terms of the radius, the edge glow, it's kind of your personal preference. I'm going to leave it up to you guys. You can crank that way up if you want that up there. And then secondly, the strength. I don't have the strength set very high. If I crank the strength way up, you start to see these big definitive lines around objects. That obviously isn't going to help your picture. So you got to be careful as to how much, or in this case, if you take it right off, then you don't get any of those kind of accents and stuff. So I'm going to leave it on there so I get a little bit of extra definition in some of the contrasted areas. You can play with your tone and detail. So your gamma, this gives you basically no color, be like a black and white representation almost, whereas all the way up is like an oversaturated kind of crazy view. So you want to, again, get yourself somewhere in the middle that it still looks photorealistic, but gives you enough saturation and enough interest in your photo that it does look different than something you could just take in a single shot. Again, your exposure, you can underexpose the photo completely, you can overexpose the photo completely, because now you're working with quite a different range of color values. So again, I know that the day was not super dark that day, so we're going to bring it up enough that it's bright enough that we can start to see some of the detail in the trees here and in the water and in the sky. If you notice this boat, if you look really closely, if we zoom into 100% here, the boat looks a little bit weird. These guys were moving, and so some of the splashes and things show up in a little bit funny place. But again, by clicking that remove ghosts, if I turn that off, you can see that there's a couple different hats, a couple different arms, another 2 heads over here, right? So by clicking that remove ghosts, it just analyzes this one photo, and it tries to keep as much of the information from that photo being used primarily. We're going to go back to fit here. You can play with your shadow values to, again, make the shadows brighter so they dissipate a little bit, so you get more detail in that shadowed area. You can also obviously bring those right down to give them super dark and add to that contrast effect. I prefer somewhere in the middle here. Similar to your highlights, right? You can dim your highlights all the way down. You can brighten them all the way up. In this case, I think this kind of angry, darker clouds and darker sky looks really cool. So we're going to bring, and then you can, same with the vibrance. You can crank it all the way up. In this case, it's already pretty vibrant. If I bring it all the way down, again, it's another way to create that sort of black and white. It's not true black and white. It just dulls the photo down and doesn't allow you to show off the colors and the true issues that are going on within the photo. So I'm going to leave that fairly high. Saturation, similar, right? If you oversaturate something, you can pull out those colors super bright. You get some cool reflections and things in the sky. If we desaturated it, we would have no color and it would be black and white. So in this case, we're going to go again somewhere on the higher spectrum so we get some really cool shades and tones throughout the sky here. Now once we are finished with this, if we like the look of this, if we really like this setting, if we know that we're going to be doing a whole bunch of different versions of this photo, or we shot a bunch of different HDRs on the same day, it's really important that we make ourselves a preset so that we can then simply just one click and we are able to save a lot of time messing around with all these settings down the road. The last thing I'll show you quick before we save everything is you can adjust your curve as well. Lots of different people will want to come in here and they make fine adjustments to darken certain areas of the photo. You can bend this, as you can see, it changes your photo drastically depending on what you're doing. If you mess it up, you can just say reset it to flat. Okay. The problem is that this curve is also established by some of the adjustments you made in other places and by the way that it was shot. So just like anything in Photoshop, if you Control Z, you can go backwards and bring it back to kind of that original curve that we had. And again, if you want to make some tweaks, you're more than welcome to adjust things as you see fit to create more or less tone variation and more or less depth in your photo. If you want extra points, you just click between a line and now you can create another point in here. So I kind of like this sort of super moody, kind of purpley pink sky, some orange hues in there as it was fall. I think it just looks really cool. So we're going to keep this, but before we do that, like I said, we're going to go into our preset options here. So this little box at the very top, and we're going to save this preset. So I'm going to call this one Mr. Right Fall. Whoop. And we'll save this as our preset, and we'll just select OK. And now what it's going to do is Photoshop will, you can't see it, it's popped over on my other screen here, there it is, merging to HDR. So it's taking these three layers, it's doing the conversions, it's doing all the prep work to take those three images that we originally gave it and squish them into one HDR image, which then we could do further editing on if we wanted to crop this, if we wanted to add more layers, if we still wanted to kind of brighten the whole photo, darken the whole photo. There's all kinds of different things that we can do within Photoshop on top of the original HDR photograph. So maybe we want to like sort of split tone this and have the sky be even darker. Well, we could create a mask and we could do a contrast or a hue and saturation, and we can do a whole bunch of different effects to this photo. For today, we're going to stick with just HDR and the processing required for just HDR. So we're going to go File, Save As, and then in here I need to find my F drive just like I always do, I'm going to go into my Comtech folder. In this case, it's photography and it's HDR. And by default, it gives it the HDR, like untitled HDR, and then whatever number you happen to be on in your sequence on your various computers. For us, obviously, we want to give it a name, so we're going to call it Mr. Wright, and we'll go underscore HDR underscore 01, or you can just say even just HDR 01. That gives you exactly what you need to save it. I would save it as a Photoshop document for this time to make sure that it is editable down the road in case you had made any adjustments or extra edits to it. If you saved it as a JPEG, that's fine. It just means you won't be able to go back later and make any adjustments to that photo. So that's kind of how to do HDR in a nutshell. I'm going to do another version for you just to show you the difference in different photos taken with different starting values. In terms of this one was a very muted, very dimmer looking photo. We were able to create still quite a bit of definition out of it, but it is definitely more on that monotone. It's less vibrant, less true bright colors involved because of the fact it was a cloudy day that day. The nice thing though about once we've saved this to PSD, we can obviously close this document. We're not going to lose it. It's already saved. If you happen to open up Photoshop first and you already have your images organized and you know where those HDR photos are, you can actually, from right within Photoshop, you can go to File, Automate, and you can say merge to HDR Pro. It's right within Photoshop, and it allows you, it pops up with this little dialog box and it allows you to use whatever you want. So you could do a folder worth of a folder worth of files if you had already put them into a set, or you can specifically do just by files, right? So in this case, we're going to do files because I know that there's more than one set of HDR photos in that folder. We're going to hit browse, and I've already was in here looking for the photos. I'm going to give you guys the thumbnail view so that you can see what's going on. Okay, so this was the 3 that we had did originally. We're going to do this next batch of 3 that I took in Kananaskis country. Beautiful place. Went there a couple years ago with some family, my wife, and had a chance to take some really cool pictures. Just a beautiful day that day at a little pond. If you hit OK, it will now bring up those 3 photos. It'll ask you, okay, are these the 3 that you want to attempt to automatically align and work with? And you want to just say, yep, okay, sounds good to me. So Photoshop's going to automatically open them up, get them aligned. From there, just like before, it'll open up the HDR Pro. Now, again, I'm going to have to resize this just slightly so it fits on the screen for you guys to see. There we go. And then we're going to fit this photo to our view. Okay, so again, I've already got some presets set up. So I have this Donnie preset that I like to use. If you notice, very saturated, has lots of highlights and shadows and quite a bit of detail. The detail's cranked right to the top. If we go something into the Mr. Wright Fall, gives us a very different look. So this may not work specifically for this photo because it's a much brighter photo, has much more saturation. So when we crank up those values, initially it gives us a weird look. So I'm going to go back to the Donnie preset that I had set up. I like this slightly darker view when it comes to landscape photos. You get some pretty neat reflections here in the sky. You get some really nice contrast and some really cool definition and detail on the path across the way. I just want to show you something about the settings regarding these photos. If you look in Adobe Bridge, the day I took these, I was just using a handheld camera. I did prop myself up against something. I was leaning up against a big railing so that I had a little bit more of a firm hold on things, because if you look, this middle exposed photo is f 10.0 1/60th of a second, ISO 100, so a pretty decent quality photo. If you look at the darker one, obviously underexposed means I increased the shutter speed, so it was 1/250th of a second, and then the final photo was 1/15th of a second, so pretty slow for handheld, but not too bad. If you notice, because I was propped up against something, the camera did a decent job of capturing the detail and kept things reasonably sharp in terms of the photo quality with regards to that. So we'll just get out of bridge here. This photo, I like the look of it. Everything looks decent. One setting I didn't mention before is if you check this edge smoothness, it does create a different effect. Now that may or may not be what you want. In my case, I like this like harder, more firm look to it, a little bit sharper in some areas. But yeah, definitely it's your preference as to how you do these edits using the Merge to HDR Pro. From here, I'm just going to select OK. That will again close this down, but it'll bring up these settings into Adobe Photoshop, and we'll be able to do any last minute tweaking that we might want to do. If we want to apply any filters, any adjustments, it creates one single layer that we can work on. I always tell my kids to right click on here and to convert to smart object if you're going to make any adjustments. That way you don't wreck the original photo, you maintain its editability, and it allows you to make smart filters and smart adjustments on top of this. So if I wanted to go into here, maybe I want to use the camera raw filter and I want to use some of the properties inside of camera raw, I can definitely do that. I can bring this over here to show you some of the functionality that camera raw has, which allows me to play with the exposure of the photo. I can jack up the contrast a bit in different places. I can play with the shadows. There's not a lot of value there because once it's been flattened into one picture, you end up with a pretty steady picture. But it does allow you some adjustments here that you can play with the vibrancy. You can play with the saturation if you want to pull some of those colors out even more. When you select OK, if you notice, it'll now create a smart filter that I can make those edits to later on down the road. For now, we're finished with this one. We're just going to do a file, save as. I'm going to call this Mr. Wright 2 underscore HDR. And we are good to go. Actually, I'm going to put the 2 in the back here. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a little bit about HDR photography and processing. In the meantime, enjoy yourself. Like us if you like this tutorial. Would be awesome. Follow us. Hope you had fun, learned lots. Till next time, this is Mr. Wright and JP Comtech Tech Talks.